You have been told tech billionaires are visionaries, geniuses who build the future, while the rest of us just try to keep up. But peel back the keynote speeches and the turtlenecks and the rocket launches, and you find the same pattern over and over again. Every single one of them got to the top by exploiting workers, dodging taxes, and buying influence over the very governments that were supposed to regulate them. So today we are not talking about billionaires in general. We are talking about the tech billionaires specifically. The ones who convince an entire generation that coding in a garage and disrupting an industry makes you a hero instead of just another guy who figured out how to extract more value from more people than anyone before him. Chapter 1. Bad versus evil. We need to get one thing straight before we go any further. Bad means something is unpleasant or low quality. Evil means intent. It means causing harm and knowing it and doing it anyway because the harm is profitable. By the end of this video, you will see that every name on this list crosses that line, not by accident, but by design. Chapter 2. The Philanthropy Shield. Bill Gates spent decades building an image as the good billionaire, the one who left Microsoft to save the world through his foundation. And on the surface, that sounds wonderful. But the Gates Foundation has poured money into pharmaceutical companies and agricultural firms in ways that critics say entrench the very systems that create global poverty rather than solving it. Meanwhile, Gates paid an effective tax rate far below what most working people pay, all while being celebrated as a generous man. That is not generosity. That is a public relations strategy with a tax deduction attached. This is the same trick every tech billionaire uses. Take a tiny slice of an enormous fortune, hand it to a foundation you control, get a tax write-off, get a wave of headlines calling you a hero, and keep the rest. The public sees the giving. The public rarely sees the fortune that giving came from, or the workers who built it. And here is the part that rarely makes the headline. A private foundation is not accountable to voters. It is not accountable to a board of elected officials. It is accountable to almost nobody, except the man who funds it, and the small circle of people he chooses to run it. So when a foundation decides which diseases get research funding, which schools get restructured, and which agricultural policies get pushed onto farmers overseas, that is one unelected individual quietly setting public policy on a global scale, all while collecting a tax benefit for doing it and a reputation boost for good measure. Democracy is supposed to mean the public decides where shared resources go. Philanthropy on this scale quietly replaces that decision with the personal preference of a single, very rich man. Chapter 3. The Job Creation Myth. Jeff Bezos likes to remind people that Amazon employs more than 1.5 million people around the world. And sure, that is true. But ask any of the warehouse workers who have described having to skip bathroom breaks to hit their quotas whether that job feels like an opportunity or a trap. Ask the small business owners who watched their local stores close because they could not compete with a company that operated at a loss for years, just to crush the competition first and raise prices later. Amazon did not create an economy. It moved one. It took thousands of independently owned businesses and folded them into a single company controlled by one man who became the richest person alive doing it. That is not innovation. That is consolidation with better marketing, and it is worth asking what kind of jobs actually got created in that shift. A family that owned a hardware store made decisions for themselves, set their own hours, and kept the profits their labor generated. A warehouse worker on an Amazon floor is timed on every task, monitored by software that flags them for being idle for a few seconds too long, and can be let go for failing to hit a quota that keeps climbing. Trading independent ownership across thousands of towns for centralized control under one company is not the same thing as job creation. It is a transfer of power away from workers and communities and into a single corporate structure that answers to shareholders first and everyone else a distant second. Chapter 4. Buy, Borrow, Die. The Tech Edition. Elon Musk is the perfect case study for how the ultra-wealthy avoid taxes while everyone else pays their share. Step 1. Own a massive amount of stock in your own company. Step 2. Borrow against that stock at a tiny interest rate because banks fall over themselves to lend to a billionaire. Step 3. Live off of that borrowed money, which is not counted as income and therefore is not taxed like income. Step 4. When you die, pass the stock to your heirs through legal structures that erase most of the capital gains tax that would otherwise be owed. Reporting based on leaked tax records showed that in certain years, Musk paid an effective federal tax rate in the single digits. A warehouse worker or a teacher pays a far higher percentage of their income in taxes than the richest man in the world does most years. That is not a loophole. That is the entire system working exactly as billionaires designed it to work. Chapter 5. Buying the government. It is not just tax law that gets bent in favour of tech billionaires. It is the government itself. Musk spent enormous sums backing political campaigns and for a period of time held direct influence inside a federal cost-cutting initiative that reviewed the very agencies responsible for regulating his own companies. Picture that for a second. The man being investigated by federal regulators for his rockets, his cars, and his social media platform was simultaneously given a hand in deciding how those regulators are funded and staffed. Meanwhile, Sam Altman built OpenAI on the promise that it existed to make sure artificial intelligence would benefit all of humanity. That promise was baked into the company mission statement, but OpenAI restructured itself in ways that opened the door to enormous profit, took on a deepening partnership with Microsoft worth tens of billions of dollars, and pursued a path toward going public that stands in direct tension with the non-profit ideals the company was founded on. The mission did not disappear, it got repriced. Zuckerberg followed the same script when it came to Washington. For years, Meta spent enormous sums on lobbying, more than almost any other company in the country, while facing repeated congressional hearings over privacy, child safety, and election integrity. The hearings made for good television. Lawmakers asked pointed questions. Zuckerberg apologized on camera more than once, and then the lobbying spending went up the following year, not down. That is not a company learning its lesson. That is a company that has calculated the cost of a public apology is far cheaper than the cost of actual regulation, so it keeps paying for the apology instead of changing the behavior underneath it. Chapter 6. What history already proved. None of this is new and none of this is inevitable. Between 1940 and 1960, the top federal tax rate in the United States sat around 90%. 90, not 19. That period produced the largest expansion of the middle class in American history. Homes were bought, wages rose, unions grew strong enough to negotiate real power for workers. Then in the decades that followed, tax rates on the wealthy were cut again and again, from 90% down to 70, then to 50, then all the way down to 28% under Ronald Reagan. Guess what happened to wealth inequality after that? It exploded. This is not a mystery, and it is not an accident. It is a direct result of policy choices that tech billionaires and their lobbyists fought hard to make permanent. Chapter 7. The individual scorecard. Mark Zuckerberg built Facebook on the promise of connecting the world, then presided over a company that allowed the harvesting of personal data for political manipulation on a massive scale, faced record-breaking regulatory fines for privacy violations, and then poured tens of billions of dollars into a metaverse vision that most users never asked for and mostly ignored. Billions spent chasing a virtual world while real communities dealt with the platform choices Meta had already made. Bezos built the retail infrastructure that runs much of the modern internet, then spent part of his fortune on an 11-minute trip to the edge of space while warehouse workers organized against injury rates and grueling productivity quotas. Back on the ground, he never has to stand on for a full shift. Musk positioned himself as the man saving humanity through electric cars and rockets, while facing a Securities and Exchange Commission settlement over misleading statements about taking Tesla private, while Tesla faced lawsuits and investigations tied to its full self-driving claims, and while workers at Tesla factories described conditions that labor organizers called unsafe and retaliatory. Gates positioned himself as the elder statesman of tech philanthropy, while quietly using his personal investment vehicle to become the largest private owner of farmland in the entire country, raising questions about how much influence one man should have over food systems without ever facing an election or a vote. Altman positioned himself as the responsible steward of the most powerful technology of our generation, while steering the company that built it toward a structure built for massive profit and a future public offering, the exact outcome the founding mission promised to avoid. Chapter 8. What you can actually do. I am not telling you that capitalism itself needs to disappear tomorrow. I am telling you that a rigged version of capitalism, where a handful of men write the rules that apply to everyone except themselves, is not the same thing as a free market. A regulated system with real taxation and real accountability built the strongest middle class in American history once already. It can happen again. You personally are not going to out-earn a billionaire, and that was never the point. What you can do is stop mistaking their marketing for their character. Support real journalism that investigates these companies instead of just reviewing their newest product launch. Support policy that closes the loopholes these men use to avoid paying their share. And stop assuming that because someone built a massive company, they must be a good person. Building something big and being good to the people who built it with you are two completely different things, and tech billionaires have spent 20 years hoping you would never notice the difference. There is also something smaller and more immediate you can do, which is simply pay attention to how these stories get told. Every keynote, every product launch, every carefully staged interview is written by a team of people whose entire job is to make a man who runs one of the most powerful companies on earth seem relatable, humble, and misunderstood. Notice when a headline about a round of layoffs sits right next to a headline about a record-breaking quarterly profit for the same company. Notice when a billionaire donates a small fraction of his net worth and the story gets covered as a major act of generosity. None of this requires you to become an expert in tax law or antitrust policy overnight. It just requires you to ask one simple question every time you see one of these men on your screen. Who benefits from me believing this story the way it is being told to me? If this broke down something you had not fully connected before, let me know in the comments. And make sure you are subscribed for the next investigation.